Hello, everyone. Welcome to you all to the last discussion at this Youth and Leader Summit, the 10th edition. I'll be the moderator to close this panel. My name is Perrine. I'm a first-year master student in international governance and diplomacy. But I'm not only a moderator. Throughout those 3 days, I've also been a Pol.is rapporteur, as well as 4 other people, from which 3 of them are here with me. Pol.is has been a tool that has been available for the past 3 days for you to be able to share your opinion by commenting on the platform, as well as being able to engage with one another's opinion by disagreeing or agreeing with the statements. After 3 days, there has been more than 200 participants on the software, and more than 3,000 voted casts. So today, our Pol.is rapporteur team has looked through and analyzed, as well as extracted your most striking opinions to engage with them. Whether polarized or harmonious, we have aimed to identify sources of concern to discuss and raise them up during these conversations, because those concerns of future policymaker, maybe future diplomat, future activists, should not only inform how the future of the global system will look like, but should rather already inform today's world and today's action. So in the spirit of an intergenerational dialogue, the session titled rightfully so, I hope, Next Generation Expectations, the Future of International Cooperation, is meant to engage with your thoughts, worries, and consideration for the future despite our turbulent times with our leader here, Ms. Cristina Gallach. If it is okay with you, I'll continue by calling you Cristina.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So Cristina is a journalist and a former United Nations official. She has served as the UN Under-Secretary General for Communication and Public Information, as well as the High Commissioner for the 2030 Agenda of the Spanish government. Between 2020 and 2021, Cristina was the 14th Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the Spanish government, and prior to this, at the EU, she led the communication of the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy and then the Public Relations Department in the Council of the EU. She currently is the Secretary of the Boards of Global Women Leaders Voices, an organization of women leaders from all regions and all backgrounds, committed to building a gender-equal international system that effectively responds to today's challenges of sustainable development, peace, security, and human rights, which I hope are a subject that you've been covering throughout your studies and that we have been discussing throughout this summit. That is why, with such a continuous global engagement to foster international cooperation on this wide range of issues, Cristina's experiences provide meaningful, valuable insights into this summit overarching questions: what future for international cooperations? Without further ado, I'd like to start with the first question that is informed that this last day of the summit, and with the amphitheater with students, waiting to hear from current leader and the struggle of the current international order, in the hope of hopefully becoming better informed leaders, they have been putting themselves in your shoes. But I was also wondering, maybe we should also ask you to put yourself in our shoes. And I was thus wondering, when you were a student, how did you envision the future of international cooperation? And what motivated you to seek changes in the global system?
Do I have an hour or two to talk about that?
I'll be brief. You know, my time as a student at the university was very much marked by the special circumstances of my country, Spain, which was at that time undergoing a transition from dictatorship to democracy. So I had an extremely strong ambition to become a journalist, to report about transformations in my country and across the world, that I wanted to be international correspondent. And it was, for me, very important to be able to communicate to my citizens, my fellow citizens in Spain, what was going on in the world. because unfortunately we had been living under a dictatorship, which was going down in terms of pressure to the citizenship, but had not allowed us to move freely. For example, we were not members of the European Union, and for us it was so important to be part of the international institutions and organizations.
Thank you so much for your answer. And so for the first topic that was first discussed in the summit, I will leave the floor to Nicolas.
Is it working? Yeah. So thank you, Perrin, for this thoughtful introduction. So my name is Nicolas Cher. I'm a first-year student in international governance and diplomacy, and so I had the opportunity to be a member of the Pol.is team and see all the points of view of the audience throughout the summit. And we had the opportunity to see patterns of opinion emerge, and we are very thrilled to share them with you today. So thank you, Cristina, again for being with us today. So going back to the very first day of the summit, we had the chance to listen to a very wonderful panel of guests on a discussion on finance, on the road to Séville, and more specifically on the idea of a financial system fit for sustainable development. So interestingly, this topic received the biggest amount of statements on our platform and presented some of the most polarizing statements of the summit. So I want to start off with this one, which is in a sense summarizes how students feel today about our current financial system. So 58% of voters think that the current financial system is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development and must be completely overhauled. 66% also agree that prioritizing sustainable development in finance will not have socioeconomic negative consequences, notably on economic growth. So do you believe that a new financial system focused on sustainable development is reachable without having negative consequences, notably on economic growth?
I think we have to do and make all the efforts to make it compatible. To make it compatible because what do we need, and probably that was what the participants expressed, is a rejection of the inequalities. So to have an international financial system which ensures that there is redistribution. Second, that it ensures that the big issues that are of concern of the current younger generations, the future older generations, are addressed. Climate change, this is fundamental. And that the financial system really addresses the issues of the majority. And I would say equality, gender equality. So all these for me are key issues, and we have to make it compatible. We will be having very soon in Madrid, in Sevilla, the next Financing for Development conference. And that is a great opportunity to ensure that we bring ideas, and the different representatives of all the members of the UN bring ideas to make the international financial institutions suitable for sustainable development. That is the core of the discussion. The institutions that we have now do fall short of what we do need. Therefore, that's a great opportunity. This summit, it would also be an opportunity to look at things from the perspective of intergenerational challenges and from the perspectives of the interests of the current countries that dominate the financial institutions and those in the global south that feel they are excluded from the decision-making processes of the financial institutions.
Thank you so much. And it's very interesting and also linked on growth. We also think it's about finding a balance between economic growth and trying to fight climate change. Very interesting figures as well. 55% of voters think that economic growth in a neoliberal system is not compatible with environmental sustainability, but also 55% of voters think that developed countries should not dive into degrowth. So we see here that there is this dilemma of knowing that economic growth is not fit for sustainable development, but degrowth is not the solution either. I had another question on finance. I want to raise the statement that I received the most disagreeing votes, with 66% of votes against the idea that developing countries should be exempt from strict environmental regulation to allow to faster economic growth and poverty reduction. How do you think we can create a global consensus on financial system directed to environmental stability when some developing countries that contributed less to the current environmental situation have to carry the burden of not using the same developing processes than developed countries that contributed more to climate change?
I think it's absolutely understandable that many countries feel that they are brought into an impossible situation. They have to face the enormity of investments to have a green economy and green energy, and they don't have the means, and they are suffering the consequences of others. We see this in the Caribbean islands, we see this in the Asia-Pacific territories and islands that they have been suffering all sorts of floods, etc., and inclemencies. But nobody, no country should be exempt of the obligations of and the responsibilities of addressing climate change. But, and that is very important, but they have to be supported, they have to be helped, they have to be encouraged, and that is what we call climate finance. That is the obligation of those that have been more responsible for the carbon emissions, for the current situations, to really face the generosity and the responsibility of supporting those that are in a more difficult situation. We saw last COP29, which really falls short of the commitments, of the financial commitments that are needed to support the countries that face the biggest burden. So it's a responsibility that we cannot address, but everybody has to be playing its part, but those that are in more a fragile situation, they have to be helped. And I think the climate finance is very important.
Thank you. I was maybe just wondering about this also. Do you think there is action that needs to be taken at the UN level or at the national level to tackle this issue of responsibility?
Well, at the UN level, for sure, we have the structures. We have the conventions that regularly meet. We have the bodies, UNFCCC, which is the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, the Convention to address issues related to droughts, etc. So definitely at UN level is very important. Why? Because this is a global issue. But we should also look at regionally. For example, Europe as a region is very much at the forefront and is also very much at the forefront of sharing the responsibilities internal and of addressing through development support the shortcomings of other countries. So definitely we need to work at a multi-layer address. What minor action might be taken a local administration, even if it's minute, it's very important. For example, of managing water resources. So I think the connection, the vertical connection of activities at the local level to the global level, all of them in a very well intersected way, following the UN guidance, following the UN agreements, I think it's very important.
Thank you so much for this answer. And so we've first discussed finance, but there has been other subjects that have been discussed throughout the summits, and one of them was humanity and compassion. So I'll leave the floor to Anaïs for this.
Okay, thank you, Perrine. So my name is Anaïs Server, and I'm also a first-year student in international governance and diplomacy. And I was very struck by yesterday's TED Talks on the role of compassion in institution. It was with prosecutor Dizalo, who emphasized the importance of bringing more humanity and empathy into our institution. particularly in the judicial system, to strengthen its legitimacy and impact. And the police results show that most students support this vision. And now, Cristina, I have a very simple and straightforward question for you. What do you think is the role and the place for compassion in the UN?
Well, I would like you to think about the UNRWA workers that have been assassinated or killed in the last months in Gaza. Were they not compassionate workers? Were they not doing the maximum they could do to help the community there? So I have no doubt that there is an enormous amount of individuals working for the UN, wearing UN helmets, wearing UN whatever, which are absolutely compassionate. And if I see a need to reflect more on these attitudes, it's probably more into the bodies, probably more that in the people that sit in offices and plan and structure. They are necessary because you know, the local work needs somebody that plans. And I think the key towards would be emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, those leading the planning, leading the operations. Also, emotional intelligence in leading groups. We all know that you lead by example, but you need lead by the manner in which people work. Yes, I think that the UN workers at more admin level might be perceived as dry, as bureaucrats. It is true, the UN is a bureaucracy at the very end. I'm looking at Arancha, she worked many years for the UN. Sometimes we said, oh my God, where are we, no? But don't forget those that are, for example, now delivering the basic food in Sudan, in South Sudan, where on top of the civil war in Sudan and on top of the terrible crisis in South Sudan, you have a flood. So I think it's very mitigated. But yes, bringing a good dose of emotional intelligence is extremely important. At the UN and outside the UN, I would say.
Thank you for this. That was very interesting to have this insight direct insight from your experience in the UN. And I guess the next topic is following the intervention of the Secretary General of the WTO, and I'll leave the floor for Victor for this.
Yes, thank you. We'll come back to the UN, but first we'll talk about trade. So my name is Victor. I'm a second-year student at the Masters of International Governance and Diplomacy, like so many else. And I hope everyone has enjoyed the summit and also used the Pol.is tool, of course. And as mentioned, I will ask some questions to you about from the sessions yesterday. So one of the most divisive statements we had actually in the entire Pol.is tool came from this session mentioned, which was with the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, on the topic of the future of the multilateral trading system. And I personally found her very inspiring and charismatic to listen to. And there was this statement, which before the session began, it was perfect 50-50 split among those opposing and those supporting the statement. And I will read the statement for all to hear. So it reads, despite the dysfunction of the appellate body of the WTO, the organization is still able to fulfill its general function to a satisfactory extent. So this was a perfect 50-50 split before, which is very satisfying to see because it's rare to see a perfect split. And I believe that DG Okonjo-Iweala, she brought up some very good points and interesting arguments, which I personally found very convincing. She argued that trade conflict resolution never was the main mission of the WTO. It was one of them, but not the only one. And she mentioned some consensus breakthroughs that have been reached despite the paralysis of the appellate body, such as the WTO agreement on fishery subsidies, which was adopted in 2022. But despite her arguments and explanations, students were not convinced, it seemed, because even after her session, this perfect 50-50 split continued throughout the day, even as more students gave their opinion. So, Cristina, now I will leave it for you to give the tie-breaking vote of this 50-50 split on whether the WTO does fulfill its function or not. And I will also add another part to this, because I also want to ask more generally what you see in the future of the multilateral trading system if the world is on the path to a polarized world, with, which might be split in one or multiple parts, and how countries could best respond to the rise and threats of subsidies and tariffs in major world economies.
Okay. I really agree with you in your analysis of her intervention. She's a really charismatic lady, and I think if we would have had her for 2 sessions, the 50-50 would be 70-30, because she really carries the arguments through, and she does in a very convincing manner with examples. So, considering the talk about tariffs, considering all what we have seen of the international trade being upset and disrupted because of COVID, considering what goes on chips produced in Asia that don't come to Europe and the blocks, etc., I think it's already very good to have 50-50, because you are giving to this organization a very difficult job, constantly challenged by daily circumstances, and now challenged by the #1 economic power in the world. So frankly speaking, I think it's a very good score. I don't know in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, because there continues to be a lot of talk about more tariffs and blocks to free trade, etc. So I am not optimistic, but I think that it is less the responsibility of the WTO organization than the responsibility of the key member states, those that have been championing free trade, and now they are championing something else. And we do not know exactly how this is going to go. So yes, we need to reform the system, because even with or without what is going on now with the US leadership, there are 2 or 3 realities: geopolitical shifts, fragmentation, trade wars and protectionism, and technological transformations. So these already pose us in front of a dilemma that no matter what, we need to infuse strength and new horizons to WTO.
It's interesting, the topic of reform and the when and the how and where.
Yeah.
It was I think very present in many of the talks, and it also followed in the debate, which was after this talk on the topic of the quite openly asked question of, do we still need the UN? And this talk had 4 distinguished speakers, which were arguing some for and some against the question posed, together with some student presenters. And the debaters on both sides, both supporting and opposing the need of the UN, seemed to still agree on the need for reform. Then whether how much and how dramatic it should be different, but they seem to be on the same track. And so did the students also participating in Pol.is agree on the need for reform, and also students on Pol.is also agreed on the issues of representation in the UN and its failure to handle some major crises. And while recognizing these weaknesses, the students were still in favor to a large extent of the usefulness of the UN, but with a side note of the need for reform. And I picked out one statement which was a bit polarizing, though most students supported this statement. It says that regardless of whether we need the UN, its increasing display of incompetence means it's on the road to becoming obsolete. So this was one of the devising ones, and on the other hand, we have one statement, or actually multiple statements. It's a statement that was submitted multiple times, because this is a statement which the majority of students expressed a strong support for. And the debaters and students agreed on the need for a female Secretary General of the UN. And we actually received several statements on Pol.is which called for our own Arancha González to step up to the helm. And so at least it seemed that if we here at Sciences Po were to vote, then that would be a very done deal on that question.
This, the General Assembly and Security Council of next year.
So at least we students seem to agree on something there. So my question to you, Cristina, then, with your rich experience and knowledge of the UN, and since you're also a member of the Global Women Leaders Voices, together with Arancha, which has launched the Madam Secretary General campaign, which calls for the support for the appointment of the first female Secretary General. So my question is simply, how do you think we can make this happen, to have a female Secretary General, and what will be needed to achieve this? And I will add a second question once again. So regard to the first more polarizing statement, I'm curious to hear on whether you believe that the US is on the road to becoming obsolete without reform, and also what reform might need to be implemented to get the organization back on track, to regain its relevance, and also the trust of the public and the global community.
Okay. You know, the words incompetent and obsolete are very harsh. I think they are too harsh. Let me say something. The UN is the first organization to arrive when there is a need, and the last to leave. The last to leave, the first to arrive. And I think this means a lot, because there are people in the world that have been fed by the UN, have been given shoes by the UN, have been educated by the UN. In fact, there was a Secretary General that I served, Arancha also served as Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who said his first notebook was given by the UN Education Organization, UNESCO. His first pair of shoes was given by UNICEF because he was a refugee during the intra-Korean War. So I think we have to reflect a little bit before saying these words. Definitely, the world has changed so much since the basic institutions of the UN were created in 1945, that they need reform. It's so obvious. We have the bipolar world after the Second World War. Now we have a totally different world. We have a unipolar world that is moving towards a much more complex situation. And we have a Security Council with 5 permanent members that has no representation from Latin America, from Africa. The increase of population in the world is going to be in Africa, and they are not permanently represented. So definitely reform is there, and definitely one way to bring reform, the much needed reform, is to have a women Secretary General, because it will be it will be the first time after 9 Secretary Generals, an individual that will have a view of transformation, will have a vision of the need for fight for equality, will have a relationship with the daily issues that suffer, the inequalities that suffer women across the world. And I think it will be definitely a way to advance towards this vision of adaptation of the structures to the new times, to the current times. So that's why I so fondly joined the campaign, Madam Secretary General. Will it be an end in itself? No, you know, we don't want a woman to be there for the sake of being a woman. We want a woman because we want to give it the chance that now has been given to 9 men, but they have not been able, maybe they have not been fully supported in that journey, but now I think it's the time, and the objective is for making the UN adapted to the current times. Okay.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Well, I had a follow-up question related to the UN, but you kind of answered to the points of the question, because we wanted to raise that 65% of voters in the audience agreed with the following statements, more on how the UN is perceived and less on its competencies. The statement is the following: the UN's power structure is undemocratic, outdated, and unrepresentative as it protects Western interest and reinforces their influence. Well, you already answered a bit with mentioning the UN Security Council with permanent members, with New African countries or Latin American countries. You talked a bit about why we would need a woman as Secretary General. But yeah, my question was more, how do you think we can change that perception, this undemocratic feature of the UN, unrepresentative and outdated, and how can such a structure perceived that way can actually protect human rights effectively?
Okay. Let me also mention how important member states are in the UN. You know, the UN is, yes, the global organization, yes, a myriad of agencies, programs, structures, also an immense amount of law, of covenants, of treaties that are guiding our developments. And we are asking a system which is very complex to move to be ready for every new challenge. Now, for example, technology. We are asking the UN to come up with, well, how do we regulate artificial intelligence? Well, artificial intelligence is from today, and we have not yet been able to evaluate it as it is. We already asked the UN to take the lead. So we really give to these bodies an enormous burden in responding to every challenge. But sometimes we do not look at the role that member states play. The UN cannot walk quicker or faster and further than what the member states allow. And one thing that we have all observed is the frustration of the Secretary General and of the very senior officials when addressing the Security Council and the General Assembly, and they don't get the support, the resources to approach. So don't put all the burden on this organization, but on the members of the organization. I'll give you another example. Now the United Nations is in a funds crisis. It's not only defunded, not only underfunded, but is defunded. So some member states are withdrawing financial support for example, issues so critical such as reproductive health and reproductive rights, such as issues related to gender equality. And the UN cannot produce the resources it needs to operate in so many places in need. We spoke about climate finance. The Secretary General and the chair of the UNFCCC Convention request member states to provide financial support for the countries that have to do the transition and can't because they don't have sufficient resources and they suffer disproportionately the impact, and these resources don't come. So we have to have a more sophisticated analysis and ask those that are responsible, that have the means and the resources to contribute as well to ensure the well-functioning of the organization. I think only with this symbiosis of UN leadership, member states, empathy, support, and working together, we will get a more functioning UN and a more efficient UN.
Thank you so much. So you would say that you're pretty optimistic?
I would say that we have to be optimistic, but we shouldn't expect that this is going to be addressed on its own sake. It's going to be addressed with a lot of pressure and with a lot of generosity and a lot of solidarity. When we hear the member states, the president and prime minister addressing the UN General Assembly, we are sometimes put off because they instead of coming with a myriad of proposals and energy to make the UN system function, they just come to ask for their individual interest. And I think that's a key challenge. And we see it clearly in areas like peace and security. We need to put more efforts into prevention, but we hardly have resources for other very basic issues. And we are piling new issues, like we were talking about technology and about AI, etc. So we cannot be optimistic and expect things are going to happen. We have to be optimistic because we work and we continue engaging and we continue appreciating the fundamentals of working together of multilateralism.
Thank you so much for this answer. You've been mentioning that the UN has been defunded, right? And that you've been seeking, that there has been call for seeking further funds outside of usual fund, I'm assuming. Can you maybe expand on this idea of which type of other funds?
Yeah. Okay, the United Nations has two ways or several ways to be funded. One is every country has its own contribution. And you know, there is a practice which, you know, some countries pay late. So if you do not get the regular resources expected, you will not be able to carry not even the responsibility of paying the salaries of those engaged. Then you have another type of financial resources, which is voluntary. A group of countries or a country say, well, our national position is to support gender equality. So I'm going to bring some funds to UN Women or UNFPA, or another country say, my national policy is more into climate, is more into biodiversity. So you have different ways to bring funds to the system. But there is a need because the funds required are more and more and the deficits exist. And you know, we are in a situation of constant, unfortunate natural catastrophes and also man-made catastrophes, conflicts. They need to be financed and they have to regularly, the UN officials have to regularly ask for special funds to address the most urgent needs. And it's very hard. It's very hard. You often hear those in charge that need support. And at the same time, we see how the international economic structures do produce wealth that goes to very, very rich individuals. So yes, there is a situation of lack of resources. Yes, there is also an element that should be brought into account, which is complaint that there is not sufficient transparency and accountability. And I think if there were more, probably we would have more generous individuals or governments that would be engaging in financing more. Yes, I think that one of the issues that needs to be addressed, the transparency and the accountability process of the UN system, and the redundancies. I think we had in the previous session Maria Fernanda Espinosa mentioning the redundancies of the bodies, and those that we have worked inside, we see sometimes lack of clarity because too many responsibilities too thinly spread, and this produces inefficiencies. And I think we ought to be responsible in front of our taxpayers that give money through the government for efficient implementation of programs of action.
Thank you for this answer. Maybe, because time is running, for a small last question that I've been wondering. Today we have been able to listen to Agnes Kalamar, and I was able to also attend, as hopefully many of the people in the room too. And she was discussing about, well, the crumbling of the international corporations and the international system. And in such a system, given such a future, how she was wondering and asking directly the crowd, I believe, that we should start thinking. She was urging us to start thinking about which UN treaty should be our top priority to protect if it were to completely crumble out and we would not be able to save everything. So what would be, you think, in your opinion, our top UN treaties, our top priority that we should already be working on protecting in urgency?
Well, Agnes is such a well-prepared and thoughtful person that I can only vote to myself to her wisdom, and I love to see her here. You know, I think the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it's the core that out of that declaration we have the treaties, we have so many declinations of convents, of treaties, of agreements. So I think the articles of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights are fundamental. And just looking at how Eleanor Roosevelt displayed the board, the billboard or whatever, you see the picture, I think makes me very moved. So yes, maybe going back to basics, because our life in commonality, in an organized way, through treaties, through agreements, through customary law, through whatever, basically stems from the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Thank you. I hope many here will agree with that answer. That will be a bit of hope in a bit of a dark future.
Can I add a little something? We've been discussing this today in our course. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights.
Yes, it's an important reminder for everybody. Thank you so much for everything that you've been able to share. I think maybe as a form of closing, as a form of summarizing what we've trying to convey with this conversation, this last conversation, but also with the overall Youth and Leaders Summit, I believe. Maybe first, the idea of reforms, that reforms are being urged by all type of institutions throughout the summit, that all intervenant, all speaker were speaking about reforms, and that is maybe something that we as future leader should look into, how we can reform these institutions to make them more efficient, and doing so in an inclusive manner maybe is the second point that we need to highlight there. And I think that's one of your key goal with the GWL Voices, and I hope that it will achieve always more for us to be able to add on and continue the legacy. Because in the end, it's also about believing about what we're doing and trusting in that even in difficult situations that the world is right now in, we still have belief in what we're doing, belief in our value that we're trying to protect, and in the continuity of discussion and conversation for a better world afterwards.
Okay.
And now I should welcome our favorite dean.
Let me tell you, it's the favorite dean because it's the only one you have. Sorry about that. So listen, international cooperation doesn't have to be bureaucratic. It doesn't have to be dry. It doesn't have to be boring. International cooperation can also be entertaining. It can also be creative. It can be human. It can be poetic. So let me welcome on stage Ariel Wagner, who's going to tell it with a poem. Ariel, floor to you.
Good evening. My name is Oriel. I'm a first-year student in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. And during the summit, I was inspired by all the discussions, and so I wrote a poem about hope and about peace, which I would like to present to you tonight. And it's called Piece by Piece. As I was sitting at my desk, thinking about how to call for peace in a text, my eyes wandered around my room. A shiny piece of something caught my attention. It was an old vase, broken into pieces that I had clumsily glued back together. It had been gifted to me by I don't know who, I don't know when, but since then I had carried it with me everywhere. At that moment, in its imperfect appearance, in the broken reflections of glass and uneven glue, I saw what peace means to me. Peace is fragile, but like the vase in my room, peace can be glued back together with the strongest glue there is, international cooperation. Look at the glue between the shatters, how it shows peace's frailness. But in the end, all that matters is the hand full of haleness, picking up the pieces, cutting itself and still restoring what peace is, efforts, compromises, and goodwill. Look at the vase, broken and broken again. It could simply have been casted aside. And yet, after all that strain, the glue shows that we tried. We tried to improve, and even in a world full of vice, the vase's scars are the proof that it is unique and beyond price. It's not just about the vase, it's about all that makes it one. It's how it beautifies a place, how the crystal reflects the sun. It's about how it makes thrive the most delicate flowers, how it keeps alive precious memories of ours. So, don't repeat the ways it has been broken before. Bend down and pick up the shards from the floor. Think about new ways of making glue. No matter how broken, the vase can make it through. Help those for whom bending down is hard. Be attentive, protect every shard, and always keep in mind, we have only one vase of this kind. Thank you.
Wow, what can I say? It's a great, great way to end 3 great days of discussion. Let me start by telling you something, and you will tell this to your colleagues that are not here. You will get 5 credits extra for sitting until the end of the Youth and Leaders Summit. You please make sure that you share this with your colleagues so that we create a bit of a race here. This summit is coming to an end. And I have to tell you that, and I want to start here, I want to give you a big thank you. Because the spirit of this Youth and Leaders Summit is about coming prepared, coming ready, coming animated, coming to demonstrate that you can and that you want to. And this is exactly what you showed. And frankly, you made us very, very proud through the 3 days. You play the game. One of the speakers said today, we have to avoid the tunnel vision. And avoiding the tunnel vision means engaging in the complicated, in the difficult conversations. We heard a lot of things today, yesterday, and the day before that some of the speakers felt needed to be said, and I'm sure parts of the audience felt uncomfortable with. But this is exactly what international cooperation is about. Listening to each other, even when it is extremely uncomfortable. I took 3 lessons for the 3 days that we have spent together. You know that 3 is the magic number here in Sciences Po. And I want to, before I start with number 1, I want to say that maybe we have spent too much time debating the US, what the US wants, what the president thinks, what he may do or may not do. But I want to tell you that the world is much bigger, that the US is part of this world, but that the world is very big. The world is plural. The world is nuanced. The world is diverse. And that should always be our starting point. This huge nuance, diversity, plurality of our world. So I take 3 lessons. Lesson number 1, someone said it on the first day of the Youth and Leaders Summit. International cooperation is an unfinished business. It's never completed, and it will never be completed because it's about humans. It's not about machines. There are ups, there are downs, there are highs, there are lows. Frankly, many of us in this room have been through lots of highs, and many of us in this room have been through lots of lows. But it's not the highs or the lows that drive you, it's the goal that there is always another conversation you need to have because there is still an unsolved business. The second lesson that I've taken is that the existing institutions are important. We heard from Disa how important institutions are, especially when things are bad. They provide protection. These institutions provide incredible wealth. They provide protection, they help, they facilitate, they work. But some of these institutions do not. So, yeah, we have to reform. We have to reform the institutions, especially the political ones, to make sure they reflect better the plurality of the world. To make sure they reflect better the plurality of actors. To make sure they treat issues that have not been treated because they didn't exist. Take artificial intelligence. And we certainly need, and I really thank you, Maria Fernanda, for raising this, we need reforms that provide for greater accountability. Now, some of you said, Perrine, I think it was you who said, we need ideas about how to reform. So here's 3 ideas about what reform could mean. In some instances, reform means making the existing rules more flexible so that those that feel a bit straitjacketed remain within the house. In some cases, reform will mean moving forward only with those that are ready to move forward. There is a third part of reform that I wish we don't have to face, which is the reform that comes after a major clash. So maybe those are 3 suggestions for you over the semester to ponder a little bit, because a number of these organizations are already embarked in this type of reforms. The third and final lesson that I take is that we need to humanize diverse international cooperation. That is not just about bureaucracies or bureaucratic exercises. That is not just about cold transactions. That international cooperation is not just about rules, procedures, and mechanisms. Yes, it's all of this. But international cooperation is mostly 3 Ps. People, people, people. So we need to put much more humanity in international cooperation to make it work. Let me take this opportunity to thank the incredible lineup of the speakers we have had for the first time in the 10 editions of Youth and Leaders. It really has been a diverse and plural representation of speakers. To those that remain in the room, please give them a big applause. Thank you to the New York Times, CGA-CGM, thank you to Horizons, and thank you to the GWL Voices. Their support has been invaluable to make this edition a success. Thank you to you, the volunteers, the redshirters. Thank you for being there, for running around, for guiding, for shepherding, for acting, for making sure we deliver another edition. And thank you to Julia, to Riona, to Sofia, to Marjorie, to the other Sofia, Francesca, and the entire teams. To all of you, thank you. And very much, Mark, and I thank you. Mark and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and take the rest of the week off, because as from Monday, we'll start to prepare the 11th edition of the Youth and Leaders Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye. And now my cheat sheet says that all the red shirts, all the volunteers have to come up on stage so that we take a family picture.